Hello, welcome back to Film 9, Part 2 of this series of films about historical runes and runic magic. Now, I looked at some of the early inscriptions in the last film, or in the first part of this film, I should say, and now I'm going to give you a theory that explains why these old magical inscriptions took the form they did. In particular, those rows of runes that don't seem to spell out words and don't seem to have any kind of significance. Now, I have to say I was a bit skeptical about this theory at first because, these random sequences of runes could equally have just been gobbledygook written down by someone who was illiterate, trying to impress other people who were illiterate and just wrote whatever runes came into his head. But because of this book that I've referred to earlier, there's this fantastic theory about where this sequence of runes may have come from, which I shall try and explain to you now. So, if magical words were passed from one tradition to another simply by the virtue of the fact they looked magical and mystical. If it looked magical, it could be magical. So we have the word abracadabra, which is actually a traditional magical word, but originally comes from the Latin word for an alphabet, abecedarium. But this got adopted as a magical word because it sounded to people at that time like a magical word. Now, I want us to go back to the time of the Etruscans. That's the last century BC. The Etruscans had a civilization which was thriving in northern Italy. Before Rome really took over as the Roman Empire, there were the Etruscans. These guys had a fantastic trade connection to the classical world, in particular to the Greeks and to the Phoenicians. In fact, the Etruscans got their alphabet from the Greeks or the Phoenicians. They also adopted a cult of the goddess Artemis. Now, one of the Greek peoples that the Etruscans had particular contact with were the Spartans. And the Spartans also had a cult of the goddess Artemis. In particular, they worshipped her as the goddess of writing. They called her Artemis or Thea, which means Artemis of the words. And the Etruscans took this idea on too and adopted this cult. In fact, they called her Writia, and she was the divine mistress of words. And the way that they offered prayers or votives to Writia was they wrote inscriptions on votive objects like small statues or wax tablets or pieces of horn or bone. They carved inscriptions on them and offered them to the goddess, and hundreds of these inscriptions have been found, and they all follow a formula. In the northeastern part of the Etruscan area, in the Alpine area, this formula took on a particularly abbreviated form, but it had 6 parts to it. So, the first part is to mention the name of the dedicator. Then, a dedication word. A typical dedication word was alu. Then, the name of the object, like a piece of bone or antler. Then they mentioned the goddess's name, Raisha. And then they would display a row of inscribed letters. After all, she's the goddess of writing. These letters are not trying to spell anything, they're just a demonstration of writing. And then finally, they'd have a magical symbol. One of the symbols they had was this, which in the Germanic texts ends up like this. So we have this connection established with the Etruscans. Now, the Germanic people were in contact with the Etruscans because archaeologists have found Germanic objects in Etruscan areas. So it's a really exciting idea. Perhaps this is where perhaps the cult of Raisha spread into the Germanic peoples. But there's no evidence for that. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But what if this is where the runes came from? The idea of writing spread from the Etruscan people, and the idea that writing was holy spread from the Etruscan people. So then a new myth would grow up, like runes come from the god Odin, and they are something holy and magical and can be used by mankind. And so this could be where the runes first spread from, and why the inscriptions, the magical inscriptions, follow a similar formula. But because the goddess Raisha is not, as far as we know, worshipped amongst the Germanic peoples, the goddess's name doesn't appear in these inscriptions. No god's name does. So they're not votives, they're not prayers. Now they become something magical. They're amulets, they're something intended to have a magical effect. This could be why the word Alu turns up in these inscriptions again and again. And there's a connection with another one of the power words too, Lauka, the word for leek. Now, the leek is a symbol of fertility and virility amongst the Germanic peoples. So it occurs in the poem in the Elder Edda, Völuspá, which describes the creation. And when the world was first created, it was covered in leeks, the finest of grasses. There's another poem, the Second Lay of Gudrun, where the young hero Sigurd is described as like a young leaf standing up in the grass, a young leek standing up in the grass. So again, we have this connection with leek and fertility. And this actually continues beyond the Viking Age into the medieval times. In Chaucer, leek is still there as a phallic symbol, and it occurs in the German Book of Nature. And a particularly interesting example, there's a story, a 14th century Norwegian story called Volsathatir, which means Tale of the Prick. It talks about a farmer's wife who preserves a horse's penis in linen and leeks. And then she passes this around the table when she has guests, and they each have to take this horse's penis on their lap and say verses over it. It's obviously some kind of autumnal fertility ritual. But again, we have the connection with leek. But as a virility symbol, it's also known outside Germanic areas. So there's a Roman goddess of magic called Carmentis. She also has a role occasionally as goddess of childbirth. And when she's goddess of childbirth, she's also known as Porrima. Well, the Latin word for Greek is porrum. So this is connecting her with leek. And then one of Raisha's titles, as part of her role as a goddess of fertility, was Pora, meaning leek. So this idea of leek being connected to fertility and virility, it's not obviously not just a Germanic idea. So that would seem to say that it's an older Indo-European fertility symbol that's spread amongst all these different peoples. But it ends up in the runic texts as one of the power words in the magical symbols. Okay, I'm going to end this film here. In the next film, I'm going to look at some more magical inscriptions, but particularly those used in healing. See you then.